Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of our lecture series for chapter 24 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Eisenhower Era. The focus question for this section is, how are the 1950s a period of consensus in both domestic policies and foreign affairs? Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike as he was known to many of his supporters, was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, and he emerged from that war as a military leader with great political appeal. As the Republican nominee, Ike chose Richard Nixon of California as his vice presidential running mate, who was known for his vigorous anti-communism. In the 1952 presidential campaign, Nixon's Checkers speech illustrated how TV was changing American politics. In that televised speech, Nixon featured his family dog Checkers, which greatly warmed the hearts of the American public, and this speech proved to be immensely popular. And the success of this televised speech revealed just how television could be used by politicians to craft these finely tuned public images and personas that could ingratiate them with an American public. Eisenhower was tremendously popular and made remarkable inroads even in the Democratic South, his military career being of particular importance to his success there among Democrats. Eisenhower defeated Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson twice, both in the 1952 and the 1956 presidential elections. Eisenhower was a champion of the business community and a fiscal conservative, reflecting his Republican roots. He worked to scale back government spending, but accepted New Deal programs like Social Security, and he advocated for a more mixed economy where government does play a role in economic planning. This, of course, was reflected in one of the largest government economic infrastructure investments in history, which was Eisenhower's interstate highway system. Also in response to the Russian launch of the satellite Sputnik, which initiated the Cold War space race, Eisenhower passed the National Defense Education Act, which allocated monies particularly for education of Americans in science and math in order to compete with the Russians for this domination of space-based technology. The Eisenhower era also saw the advent of a new social contract between labor and business, and many businesses began granting wage increases and fringe benefits such as health and life insurance to their employees. Unions signed long-term agreements with businesses and tried to prevent unauthorized strikes. Of course, non-union workers did not benefit from these developments, and overall, this new social contract began to weaken by the end of the 1950s. The development of the atomic bomb by the United States during World War II and the atomic age that that development ushered in was at the core of the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both the United States and the USSR developed weapons of mass destruction very quickly after the end of the war. In fact, within a couple of years of the United States dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the USSR had developed its own nuclear weapon, thanks in no small part to the fact that it had spies within the Manhattan Project that brought that information back home to the USSR with them. A new doctrine was developed in this period, the doctrine of massive retaliation, that declared that any Soviet attack on an American ally would be countered by a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. This pretty much meant what became known as MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction, where the launching of one nuclear weapon by any of the world's powers would initiate a chain reaction of nuclear launches that would pretty much ensure the massive destruction of the entire known world. Of course, this created a very intense atmosphere of fear, both within the United States and the Soviet Union, neither of which trusted the other to not press the button and launch the bomb, thus initiating that chain reaction which would assure the destruction of the world. Despite this heightened atmosphere of fear caused by nuclear tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, there did seem to be a ray of sunshine emerging in this Cold War paradigm in the 1950s. The end of the Korean War and the death of Stalin in 1953 seemed to open a window of opportunity for cooperation. Eisenhower thought the Soviets could be dealt with in conventional diplomatic terms. And new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev appeared more reasonable than his predecessor Stalin. This temporary thaw was shaken, however, when the Soviets put down an anti-communist uprising in Hungary in 1956. However, even despite that, both superpowers agreed to a temporary halt to the testing of nuclear weapons in the second part of the 1950s. However, once again, the spirit of cooperation ended in 1960 when the Soviets shot down an American spy plane over Soviet territory. The 1950s also saw the emergence of the phenomenon that became known as the Third World. And essentially, Third World countries were developing countries, many of them recently decolonized by European powers, that were aligned with neither the United States or the Soviet Union. And there quickly became an ever-escalating rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence within these developing Third World countries. The emergence of the Third World seemed to be announced to the rest of the world with the Bandung Conference in 1955, which was a meeting of these developing nations that were not aligned with either superpower. And this seemed to signal the emergence of a third power bloc within this Cold War paradigm, which neither the United States or the Soviet Union wanted to see occur. The post-war world witnessed decolonization in general, and this decolonization saw the creation of power vacuums within these new nations. As the European colonizers exited, there was intense rivalries within these third world nations on exactly where the power would lie and who would hold that power, quickly destabilizing these nations and causing the United States and the Soviet Union both to swoop down to try to assert their influence and draw these nations into their overall sphere of influence. By the end of the 1950s, the focus of the Cold War had primarily shifted to these third world countries. The Soviets in general encouraged decolonization and supported third world independence movement, primarily because it destabilized and weakened its European rivals. The U.S. was concerned that Soviet support would encourage the spread of communism, which was of course anathema to American ideals in this period. The policy of containment of the spread of communism continued and was marked by opposition to any government that seemed to threaten American strategic or economic interests. And the U.S. helped to overthrow socialist and communist-leaning governments in Guatemala, Iran, and other regions of the Third World in this period. This period also saw the United States become a major Western power in the Middle East. Both the United States and the Soviets coveted Middle Eastern oil reserves and competed for influence in the region. The Eisenhower Doctrine pledged that the United States would defend Middle Eastern governments threatened by communism and Arab nationalism. The intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence in third world countries, coupled with the United States policy of containment against the spread of communism, lay at the heart of the origins of the Vietnam War. After World War II, Vietnamese nationalist forces under its leader Ho Chi Minh and the French, who were the colonizing power in Vietnam in the period, each tried to control the country. Ho Chi Minh and his allies quickly embraced communist ideology in the early stages of this conflict, and anti-communism led to deep U.S. involvement and billions of dollars in aid sent to support the French in their conflict against Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist communist forces. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily into a communist North and a capitalist South, and elections were scheduled to unify the country and determine once and for all what the dominant power paradigm would be, whether it would be communist or capitalist forces. The United States poured money into the country to defeat Ho Chi Minh's communists, which laid the groundwork for the Vietnam War. The United States overall was becoming accustomed to intervening in far-flung corners of the world, all in its efforts to diminish and contain the spread of communism and communist ideology. In this atmosphere of heightened Cold War tensions between the forces of capitalism and communism made consensus the dominant ideal in American society in this period. Cold War politics made dissent from this consensus seem unpatriotic. However, this phenomenon was not without its critics. One was a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, who complained about the power elite, which was an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men who dominated government and society. Some people thought that Americans did not actually enjoy genuine freedom and instead craved stability and authority, and that mass society produced loneliness and anxiety. Complacency was widespread, however, despite this criticism. The bland Ozzie and Harriet image of mainstream American culture and society portrayed on TV screens across the nation and around the world belied these deep generational tensions that underscored American society and culture in this period. There were significant tensions and a general panic about juvenile delinquency. Many adults were alarmed by a new mass-marketed teenage culture that included such things as the music and images of Elvis Presley and his gyrating hips, which scandalized TV viewers around the country when he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in the mid-1950s. The advent of Playboy magazine and its unabashed and unashamed portrayal of the nude female figure also caused a moral sensation in American society at the time. And the slow rise of gay and lesbian subcultures, particularly in urban areas, which were still very much marginalized, but increasing in size and visibility in this period. Probably the most notable manifestation of this new youth culture that emerged in this period were the Beats, or the Beatniks. The Beats were a small group of poets and writers who railed against mainstream culture. Of particular note was Jack Kerouac and his novel On the Road, and Allen Ginsberg and his poem Howl. These Beats celebrated impulsive action, immediate pleasure, drug use, and sexual experimentation, and really laid the groundwork for the manifestation of the later hippie movement in the 1960s. And with that, we end part 2 of our Chapter 24 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. Believe it or not, only one more part left. Until then, study hard, and I'll see you soon.